A big part of being a successful wrestler is having a charismatic character. After all, we are largely talking about a TV product, so entertaining the audience is hugely important. But while some performers have this down, names like The Rock, John Cena, and Steve Austin, others struggle to find such a character. But who are the most generic gimmicks in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with Lance Storm. Yes, like with everyone we're going to be discussing today, we're not saying that Lance Storm is a boring person. No, he seems like a charming enough guy, but for one reason or another, this has never translated over to the ring. And it's meant that his on-screen character has always been considered a bit dull. Hell, at one point, this was literally his gimmick, with the idea being that he was so boring, he was putting then Raw Commissioner Steve Austin to sleep. Yes, when it came to engaging audiences on that level, being a technical maestro in the ring just wasn't enough for the Canadian, as, whether it be in WCW, ECW, WWE, or anywhere else, his entire gimmick tended to bore people to tears more than anything else. Sure, sometimes this would be lent into, such as when he had his notorious "if I can be serious for a minute" catchphrase. But even if he was making fun of the fact he was bland here, he was still bland nevertheless. Could things have been different for Lance had he had something else to work with? Maybe, but then maybe it's for the best that he didn't, because the last thing we want to see is him being given a dreaded wrestler with a job gimmick that were so popular in the 90s. No, that would have likely done far more harm to his character than help it in the long run, and this is not something he needed. Rather, what he needed was to be in a different time period, and we say that because his technical wrestling wizard gimmick would have probably been a much better fit if taken out of the Attitude Era and instead in the Ruthless Aggression Era a few years later. But alas, this was not the way things worked out for the Ontario native. And so, despite easily being one of the most skilled wrestlers of his generation, his legacy will always be that his character was as bland could be. And he is not the only great technician who had this problem over the years, because the same thing could be said about our next subject, Cesaro. Yes, whilst also being a great in-ring performer, Cesaro never had a particularly strong gimmick. All he was ever really presented as was European technical wrestler, something which didn't allow him to make much of a splash beyond the mid-card in WWE. Sure, there were a vocal contingent of fans who were pushing for Cesaro to get a better spot on the card, but as Vince McMahon was never a fan of his work, this would never happen. So it was then that throughout the entire time he was in WWE on either the Raw, SmackDown, or even NXT roster, Cesaro would mostly be used in the mid-card, generally as part of a tag team where he could deliver a good match, but wouldn't be thought of as one of the true stars of the show. Would Cesaro have succeeded more in the WWE if he'd created a different character to sink his teeth into? Maybe. He was an alumni of comedy promotions like Chikara from back during his days on the indie circuit, and he is, by all accounts, an entertaining guy in real life. So it's possible he might have thrived in this situation, but like with Lance Storm, we're not sure fans of Cesaro would have really wanted this of him. No, what they really wanted him to be was that stone-cold shooter that put on great in-ring performances. And so it was, after not finding the success he'd hoped for in WWE, he decided to move over to AEW in 2022 and become part of the Blackpool Combat Club. That's right, now going by the name of Claudio Castagnoli, he's been able to fit his style into a new promotion, as while he was in WWE, his whole presentation came across a little dull and lacking in character when compared to bigger performers like Roman Reigns and Cody Rhodes. Of course, while some wrestlers thrive when moving over to a different company as it allows their character to work better in a different environment, others struggle with doing this as they find their gimmick still isn't quite working. And if you need an example of this in action, you must only look to our next subject, Jack Swagger. Yes, it's unfortunate that Jack Swagger has now failed to get over in any significant way in two promotions, despite on the surface of things having all the attributes required to be a superstar. Hell, he's got a great look, great physique, is a seasoned amateur wrestler, and even has a 3-1 record in MMA. When all this is translated over to the squared circle, though, something has always been missing. And the key element in what's always been missing with him has been an engaging character, as this is just not a part of himself the Fargo native has ever been able to tap into. No, unlike the wacky cast of that iconic Coen Brothers movie, there doesn't appear to be anything naturally entertaining about Jake Hager when he's put in a ring. And this has meant that, despite WWE giving him a big push at one point and making him World Heavyweight Champion, fans just never really gravitated to him on that level. So little would they gravitate toward him. In fact, to this day, his run with the big gold belt is generally considered among the worst of all time. And it isn't like things worked out better for Swagger outside of WWE either, as upon joining the All Elite Wrestling roster in 2019, he'd find a lot of the same problems following him over there too. Yes, now going by his real name of Jake Hager, he still never really figured out what his character was, outside of the fact that he liked the hat he was wearing, and that led to way too many segments where his role was basically just to stand behind Chris Jericho and not do anything. And on the rare occasions where Hager did hit the ring in AEW, he'd never put on the greatest matches in the world either. Will this see him return to WWE one day? It's unlikely because he never fit in with that promotion particularly well either. At least he has the option to return to MMA though, if he so chooses. One person who doesn't seem to have such a backup option though is our next subject, as they've never really shown themselves to be a cage fighter. No, in the case of Austin Theory, he's going to instead have to find a more exciting character. That's right, Austin Theory. In many ways, he could be considered the man who would be king during the early 2020s, as it was in the autumn of 2021 that Vince McMahon himself handpicked him to be his next top guy in waiting. Yes, upon making the Atlanta native his new on-screen protege, it felt like the boss's mind had been made up and that Theory was now being prepared to be the guy who would one day replace Roman Reigns as the face of the company. The only problem with this, though, was that the rookie was way too green to be put in such a spot, and this led to something of a fan backlash against him. Sure, at least part of this backlash was because fans felt like it was another instance of Vince McMahon telling them what to like rather than them getting to tell him who they liked, but a big part of it was also the fact that Austin Theory just wasn't ready to be in a spot like this as, while a good wrestler, he hadn't really figured out what his character was yet. And this meant that whenever he appeared in a backstage interview or in-ring segment, he just came across as a little too bland to be a top guy. Obviously then, this has held him back greatly in the years since then, following Vince's ousting from the company, as now with Triple H in charge, he seems to be far more in tune with what his audience wants. And what his audience has been telling him is that they just don't see Theory in this spot, at least not yet. No, he's still young, very young in fact. Hell, at the time of this video's recording, he's only 27, so he still has a lot of time to turn things around. But as it stands today, he's not been able to come up with a gimmick which has felt entertaining enough for him to go anywhere beyond the mid-card of the tag team division in WWE. That said, this is not necessarily a bad thing because, in being placed in the tag team division, Austin Theory has been aligned with Grayson Waller, someone who, while he's certainly good in the ring, shines a lot more on the mic. So if anyone is going to be able to help Theory unlock that side of himself and become a more entertaining character in the process, Waller is. Will this lead to Austin one day getting to the top of the card in a singles capacity? We'll just have to wait and see, but let's move away from the men for a moment and over to the ladies for a while instead, as it's with them we find our next subject who never really managed to find a character that wasn't bland. Who are we talking about here? Why, Tamina, of course. That's right, despite being the daughter of Superfly Jimmy Snuka, one of the most charismatic performers of the pre-Hulkamania era, Tamina Snuka had never been able to tap into that same well of personality, at least not on screen. And this has meant that ever since joining WWE in 2010, she's always felt like less of a focused upon act and more of a background performer for other people's stories. Yes, whether we're talking about her early role managing the Usos, her later role being the bodyguard of AJ Lee, or her occasional tag team pairings with Lana, Nia Jax, or Natalya, Tamina has always played second fiddle to the performer who was seen by fans as being the more charismatic of the two. Not to say that Tamina doesn't have charisma when the cameras are turned off, but as we've seen already, sometimes it's a lot harder for any natural charm a person has to transfer over to the screen. Needless to say then, this is why she's never found a huge amount of success in WWE, with her only accomplishments of note being a brief run as Women's Tag Team Champion with Natalya, along with a few reigns as 24/7 Champion. And it's also why, despite always hitting a glass ceiling in WWE despite her family lineage, Tamina never thought to go elsewhere and try her luck there instead, as even if she'd done this, she likely would have had a lot of the same problems. Could she turn things around at this point and finally unlock her personality on screen? Probably not, because as of 2024, it appears she's quietly retired from the ring. But while this is a shame, at least the daughter of the Superfly was able to have a lengthy career in WWE, far longer than most of her contemporaries in fact. And with her still appearing to have some backstage role today, it looks like she'll continue to have a career there for some time to come. Sure, it would have been nicer if that career saw her become a full-blown star, but that can't always be the case for everyone. Hell, it certainly wasn't the case for our next subject, Alex Riley. No, when we talk about the career of Alex Riley, we find ourselves talking about a man who just never managed to put it all together. And this meant that no matter how much he tried, he just couldn't break out of that mid-card pack in WWE. So it was then that throughout his in-ring career there, the most notable thing he ever did was be a protege to The Miz. Why was he a protege to The Miz? Well, it seems that WWE's booking team thought pairing the Virginian with a far better talker would help him to unlock his personality and develop a far less bland character, something way more exciting than he was playing at the time. Alas though, this was not the way things worked out for Alex Riley. No, in the end he never managed to do such a thing, and that meant he was quickly lost in the shuffle of early 2010s WWE, a time when exciting personalities like CM Punk were rising to the forefront. Hell, so bad would things get for Riley, by the time the mid-2010s came around, he'd move over to the commentary booth instead. But as you can probably guess, this didn't go much better for him. Why was that? Well, if a bland and generic character can be a quick end for an in-ring wrestler, it can be an even quicker end for a commentator, as, not having any athletic skills to fall back on, if you don't get over personality-wise here, you're quickly going to flop. And this is exactly what Alex Riley did, sadly, because soon after taking up residence behind the booth on episodes of Superstars and Main Event, it became apparent he just wasn't going to be a good fit for the role. What would happen to him after that then? Well, he'd be moved over to a position as analyst on pay-per-view pre-shows. And this was a role he'd remain in for the most part all the way up until the point he finally exited the company in 2016. Sure, he would make a brief return to the ring in NXT in 2015, and since leaving WWE behind, he has occasionally wrestled on the indie circuit once more, but we don't see this ever leading to a big league contract for Alex Riley at any point now, because even if he still can go once he laces up his boots, he remains without that crucial element that it takes to be a true superstar, a compelling character. But at least he's not alone in this. No, we could say the exact same thing about our next subject too, as it happens, someone who WWE once had big hopes for but who has since pretty much disappeared into the ether. That's right, it's time to talk about Kenny Dykstra. That's right, if there was ever a case of someone who was supposed to be a Michaels but who ended up becoming a Jannetty instead, then Kenny Dykstra is it, because during his initial run on the WWE roster in 2006 as part of the Spirit Squad, it felt like the company clearly had pegged him to be the breakout star of the stable, the one who would eventually go on to great singles success. But as we all know now, that's not what happened. Rather, it would be Nikki, the man rebranded later as Dolph Ziggler, who found this success instead. Why did Dolph Ziggler rise so high when Kenny Dykstra didn't? Well, it wasn't for lack of in-ring skill, as both men had this in spades. No, the real difference maker in the situation ended up being that Ziggler tapped into his character that allowed him to get over with fans, and his stablemate didn't. Yes, despite being a very good wrestler and someone who certainly had the look, the Massachusetts native never found anything that extended beyond generic once he left the Spirit Squad behind. But then this was a problem for so many otherwise talented performers who were part of that mid to late 2000s WWE mid-card. Could things have been different for Kenny had he been able to tap into his personality on screen a little more? Probably. After all, Dolph Ziggler would go on to become a multiple-time world champion. But even then, Dolph always had a ceiling, so maybe Dykstra was never destined to be a WrestleMania main eventer or anything. Even if this was true though, he could have still done more than mill away on the Raw and SmackDown mid-cards for a few years, more often than not doing jobs to more focused upon talent. But in the end, this is not the way things worked out for him, and so it was then in 2008, after having been pretty much relegated to C shows like Heat and Velocity, the man from Southbridge would be released from his contract and there left to go and attempt to rebuild himself on the indie circuit. And while he would find some varying degree of success out there in places like Dragon Gate USA, Ring of Honor, and Chikara, he never really managed to fully tap into that personality. And this meant a full-time WWE return would never be on the cards for him. Sure, he would make a cameo appearance in 2016 as part of The Miz's attempts to get in Dolph Ziggler's head while the pair were feuding, but this wasn't exactly a stairway to the main event scene for Kenny. And since that point, his only role in WWE has been to work behind the scenes as a producer, meaning he's been right there to help our next subject, someone who's also struggled with finding an interesting gimmick over the years, Ty Dillinger. And in Dillinger's case, like with Jack Swagger, he's had the unfortunate distinction of failing to find a compelling gimmick in 2 wrestling companies at this point. And we say that because not only was he a flop in WWE in that respect, but he was also a flop in AEW. Looking at WWE first, though, it might come as a surprise that if this was ever the case, as back during his initial run on NXT between 2013 and 2017, he did manage to get over to some degree as Ty Dillinger. How did he get over at that point? Well, by having the character of a man who likes the number 10. Yeah, back then, Spears often referred to himself as a perfect 10 in terms of talent, and in true mid-2010s fashion, this led to the cartoon character of him running around saying 10 all the time. But while this would be popular for a while, like with all meme gimmicks, the joke started to wear thin after a while. And so it was then that, with nothing else to bolster it up, by the time Spears made it to SmackDown in 2017, he was pretty much dead in the water, as there was nothing new about him for fans to be able to latch onto. And so it was then that in 2019, the Ontario native would be cut from his contract. Luckily for him, though, this was also the point All Elite Wrestling was forming. Sadly, though, despite getting something of a push right out of the gate there as the chairman, pretty quickly the same problems would present themselves for Sean, in that the gimmick he had was far too one-note to ever have any lasting appeal. Yes, being a guy who liked to use steel chairs simply wasn't enough to get him over with the audience, and that meant quickly Shawn Spears would be reduced to making appearances almost exclusively on the likes of Dark and Ring of Honor. How would he respond to this? Well, he'd try his luck again when in 2024 he left AEW and returned to WWE. So hopefully there's still time for him to get over with fans, as this time round he's got experience on his side. And he's not the only NXT act that has failed to get over with fans, as the exact same thing once happened with our next subjects. That's right, we're talking about a tag team this time, namely Oney Lorcan and Danny Burch. Now, there's nothing wrong with being a tag team whose gimmick is that you're both great meat and potatoes wrestlers who get the job done once the bell rings. Hell, it's something that's worked for acts like the Brainbusters in the past. But in their case, even if the gimmick was less entertaining in its nature, there was still something there which made them interesting, a sense of an engaging character whose live audiences could either root for or boo. Unfortunately, though, in the case of Oney Lorcan and Danny Burch, once they were first paired up down on the developmental brand back in 2017, it just never seemed to have that same spark to it, as when it came to their characters, there wasn't much to write home about at all. And this led to a situation where they quickly found themselves falling into the background, as even on a show that was more territory style in its nature, NXT didn't seem to have a solid place for them. Sure, it wasn't like Lorcan and Burch never found any success on the black and gold brand. They were one-time NXT Tag Team Champions after all, with this being something they earned after beating Breezango in October of 2020. But that was about all this pairing could hang their hat on achievement-wise, and a big part of the reason for that is because their lack of engaging characters meant fans never really clicked with them in a significant way. And this would only get worse for them in 2021, as that was when NXT would make its transformation into the more character-based 2.0 incarnation, something which led to both Lorcan and Burch looking even more out of place as a result. So unfortunately, in the time since then, both men have been cut from their WWE contracts. And while Oney Lorcan has since returned, it's purely been in a backstage role. As for Danny Burch, well, he continues to work away on the indie circuit. But let's move away from the tag team division for a moment and back over to the singles one again, as that's where our next subject spent a good part of her time in WWE during the late 2010s and early 2020s. It's just a shame then that all the time she was there, she never really managed to find a compelling character. Who are we talking about this time? Why, Aaliyah, of course. And no, we're not talking about Aaliyah Mysterio here, the daughter of Rey Mysterio and sister of Dominic Mysterio, who was an occasional on-screen presence in WWE during the Thunderdome era. Rather, we're talking about Aaliyah, the woman who was first signed to a developmental contract with WWE in 2015. Not that you'd see much of her during what remained of the 2010s, however, as for all that time, during the brief periods she was showing up in NXT, she was struggling to find a gimmick which worked for her. Yes, nothing seemed to get Aaliyah over with fans, and that was because there wasn't really a huge amount to work with in terms of what she was giving them. No, more so than anything else, what she came across as here was yet another generic creator wrestler, and that meant there was never any real sense that she was building any momentum. Not that this meant WWE gave up on her completely or anything. No, in 2021, in fact, they'd give the Toronto native a chance to sink or swim in the big time when they formally moved her up to the SmackDown roster. The only problem with this move, however, was that they forgot to give her a new character before doing so, and because of that, when she did become a Blue Brand regular, live crowds reacted to her in the mildest way possible. That's right, you can count all the great moments Aaliyah had on the Blue Brand with no hands, and considering this was a woman who at one point briefly held the women's tag team titles, that's quite an achievement. The most notable moment we can think of from her run was that time she got so nervous that she threw up a little bit in her mouth in the ring, something which seemingly didn't help her career trajectory in the company. No, the reality is that by time 2023 came around and it was clear Aaliyah hadn't been able to connect with audiences in any meaningful way, she'd unfortunately be cut from her contract, with this leading to her all but disappearing from the wrestling industry, a couple of appearances at indie shows aside. But at least she's not completely forgotten because, like with everyone else we've looked at today, she's been able to be immortalized to some degree as a person who, more than anything else, just never quite found the right gimmick.